different partials, then wouldn't it increase the load time because you have to fragment? Or
You mean
handled by packaging them?
I mean, you're gonna have to load it somehow or another. It's either gonna be inside of this JavaScript file, or it's gonna be inside of an external HTML file. So it's kind of a design, you know, when you're building your app, if you have 8,000 partials, then, you know, maybe people only will ever view 100 of them. Maybe it's a good idea not to put them inside your JavaScript because most people won't see them. I would go off of that more so than, you know, how many network requests do you want to make, as opposed to, you know, do you want to have really big JavaScript files?
Caching will take care of it.
Yeah, or you can use like require.js or common.js style.
You can do
Just
that as
put
well.
it in a different file if you just want to have
Sure.
a different file, not
Sure.
async load.
So my template here, I actually have, obviously I have several nested directives here. I have an ng show directive, I have an ng click directive, I have this tooltip directive. Let's see, what do I have here? I have another ng show, I have an ng model, I have an enter submit directive, the exact same enter submit directive that I just showed you last time. I'm reusing it here. I have another ng click here, so this directive contains a bunch of other directives inside of it. They're nested down throughout the structure here. So it's very possible to create, you know, a widget that has all sorts of functionality using maybe 20, 30 different directives. So again, we'll go back and just take a peek at this. I'm using a Bootstrap.js for this tooltip. So whenever you hover over this text, that's my tooltip directive. You'll see that here. I have the tooltip attribute, and then the tip title is click to edit. So that's this. Now remember, because this view here may have been loaded asynchronously later down the road, we're not using, you know, document ready to bind, you know, Twitter Bootstrap functionality onto the DOM. It doesn't happen automatically like that. So that's why we have to put these kind of things inside of a directive. Typically, you know, if you're going to load a, you know, a jQuery slideshow onto a particular div, then, you know, it usually happens when the DOM is ready. But because we're doing everything asynchronously here, you put that sort of functionality inside of a directive. So once the DOM is loaded for this partial, then it links together, and then it applies, you know, the plugin or the Twitter functionality or whatever kind of stuff you want to do. And that's a really important thing to understand, is that your old school way of doing, you know, the jQuery, you know, document ready stuff, that stuff needs to be moved into directives, because that's when the DOM is ready, essentially. The DOM's ready inside of these directives in your linking function. So here you see I have my tooltip function, and right there I'm doing my Twitter Bootstrap tooltip, applying that to this. And I'm using the attribute tip title. So I don't know how familiar everybody is with Twitter Bootstrap things, but just little UI widgets that they have. But essentially it's just, you know, a jQuery function, and then you pass in, I'm passing in attributes tip title, and it creates that sort of functionality there. So if I click this, this is where the ng show and ng hide comes into play. So I have ng show, this is the basic text right here. So if I'm not in edit mode, it's going to show that. If I am in edit mode, it's going to instead show this input. So you can see this is not in edit mode, so it's plain text. I click edit, now it's in edit mode, so it's a text input. I say done. So it's just toggling back that function right there. Yes, no, on, off. That function is actually here. What I did is I created a controller inside of my directive. So, you know, we're used to controllers, you know, inside of, you know, wrapping around your DOM, but I'm creating a controller which is isolated scope to this particular directive here. So I can add functionality, local variables, things like that. So here on this is on the plain text, or on the button. whenever I click it, it's going to fire the edit toggle mode, which is on my local controller here. And then I just, set edit mode to not edit mode. Change the text in the button.
What's the benefit of putting your controller inside of that?
Because it's
Inside of your
isolated.
directive.
It's isolated within a directive. So if you think of a really huge application where maybe you have a stock ticker widget, and you want to take that widget and maybe put it in various multiple different places
Right.
throughout your app, you don't want your wrapping controller to have a functionality for that particular widget every single time. Because you may have 10 different pages in your site. You don't want to have your stock widget functions inside of every single one of your page controllers. So it isolates functionality to be within your particular directive.
And are those directives available to the entire scope of the application when you set them up this way?
I'm not sure what you mean. Is
Like-
this controller?
So you're adding directives to the overall scope of the project, right?
Yeah, I could put these anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, I could copy paste this line right here and put it in a completely different page or a
A
different
different
location,
controller.
wherever.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Anywhere in the app, yes. Although I do have this scope all done up here, so I do actually have, there is some functionality in this particular case, but I think the reason you asked was, why is the controller here? It's because if you want to isolate functionality and you don't want it to be tied to your parent controller, then you can create your own controller within your directive and keep things private to that particular widget.
Yeah, I like that.
And then especially when you get to nesting directives, you may have your sort of top level directive, and then it has other things underneath it. And you may want to have a controller for that top level directive that can control sub directives. It gets really deep and pretty nasty. And that's, we were talking earlier about
Circular
scope.
dependencies.
Keeping track of scope in Angular is pretty complex.
Yeah.
That definitely adds to that level of complexity there.
It's isolated using a closure, right? So the
Yes,
the
well,
function there doesn't have any successor type methods.
right, correct. Yeah, there's no way to get into this
Yeah.
from outside of the directive. Yeah, because I'm just returning this object here. So, where did I pass it? Okay, so the model, ng model is editable text, which is up here in my controller. No, that's not right. Oh, that's right. Okay. So here I have editable text. This is invoking my directive. I'm saying, this div element here is my editable text. I'm going to do all my magic here. And I'm passing in text value, which is the value. Okay, so text value is the value of this attribute. Text value is up here in my controller scope. That's what this is like my ng model essentially. Now, I said I would get back to this. When you pass in your attributes, there's different ways to pass them in. By default, it's just evaluated, like pretending like you're putting your attributes in the curly braces, and it would essentially be directives rock. If it evaluates scope text value, it would be directives rock. But instead, what I'm doing here is I'm saying the editable text attribute value is set to this equal sign here. So that's like saying whatever the name, whatever the value of that is, text value, I'm going to bind bidirectionally between the scope controller and whatever I want to apply it to down over here. So inside of my directive, you'll see I said ng model equals editable text, which is the attribute name right here. So whatever the value of this is, make that my ng model. In this case, it's evaluated the text value. So that's how I'm able to change this here inside of my directive, and then it actually changes it on the scope. Does that make sense? I have a bidirectional binding between, now watch this. If I were to say, there's three things you can do here. You can do an @ sign, you can do an equal sign, or you can do an ampersand. The two most common ones you're going to use are ampersand or @ signs, which is the default, or an equal sign, which is a binding. So if I did an @ sign here, watch what happens here. See, it just says text value because it's thinking that I'm literally passing in a string here, as opposed to a scope or a variable. Now, if I put this in double curlies, it's going to actually evaluate what the value of that is and pass that in, and that's directives wrong.
What is the ampersand for?
The ampersand is for if you want to be able to invoke a method on your controller without, there's other ways to do it. I actually prefer the other ways, which is why I don't really use the ampersand.
Okay.
But if you pass in like a method name and say the ampersand, then it'll treat it as a function on your controllers. Your parents.
Right now, you're using an interpolated, or your interpreted value, right?
Yes.
So if you change that right now, it shouldn't bind to the original?
Right.
Okay.
Correct. You got it. So, it changes locally here, but it doesn't. There's no binding between the model and the directive. So that's what the ampersand does. It literally takes a string value and passes it in. And that's it. When you use the equal sign, that's when you can use the bidirectional binding. What did I do? Oh. Aha. See? Because I passed the value in as curly braces, it's like, I don't know what's going on. This doesn't make any sense to me. And it actually probably threw an error. Yes. Because it's expecting a variable, some sort of binding, but all I'm doing is passing it a string because I have this in double curlies and it's evaluating it. So I just want to pass in the raw variable name. This is one of the things that confuse me a lot too, is when to use the curlies, when to use the variable name. What sort of binding do I want to use? The @ equals, etc.
How's their documentation overall?
I mean, it's pretty robust, but it's pretty hard to understand. It's very technical. It's complicated. It's complicated. And I've actually found, like, a lot of times if you read from the bottom of the page to the top, a lot of times, seriously, a lot of times it makes more sense to me. I don't know why. Especially on the directives page, because they start talking
Give you the
such
bottom line.
technical
They start doing
terms
CS
that you're like,
stuff.
I have no idea what they're talking
It's
about.
like reading a PhD dissertation. It's incredibly hard.
Yeah, it's just really, it's very scientific, the way that they write. But if you read from the top to the bottom, from the bottom to the top of the directives page, I think you'll have a better understanding of everything.
So starting with the example first at the bottom.
Exactly, you want to start with examples,
Yeah.
yes.
It's funny.
Exactly. All right, so does everybody understand this? I used a template to replace my original HTML element. I'm isolating the scope of the attribute values that I'm passing into it here. And I also have a controller which is isolated inside of my directive and allows me to do any sort of manipulation I want without breaking anything outside of it.
So the scope of the controller is the outer diff in the template, right?
This here?
Or the controller that you define there.
Yeah, this controller?
Its implicit scope is the outer diff of the template.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, essentially, so, typically you write a div and you say ng controller equals my controller. That's essentially what it is. I'm kind of saying like ng controller is this controller here for the main wrapper for that particular directive.
One other thing, on the directed use replace true,
Yes,
does that mean that on line 22, the text right there, that text value in the braces
yep,
is basically, doesn't really matter?
it gets wiped out.
It's like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And yeah, I'll go ahead and, that's a good question. I'll change this to false. And it didn't seem to do anything. Um, Yeah, I'm not sure why that's doing that. It's a good
Maybe,
question. It should be showing up.
As a quick experiment, maybe wrap that as a pre and add a filter over the case on.
What's that?
So
Oh,
differentiate it. Not that one, the one right there, yeah. Just type copy paste on, so we know it's different.
yeah,
Is that
nothing's
because
happening.
it doesn't have a dot, it's not the same element?